The dream of the middle class was never a natural evolution of capitalism, but a carefully engineered anomaly. A brief golden window in human history where the gears of industry and the flow of capital aligned to create a stable home-owning, upwardly mobile majority. For decades, this demographic served as the bedrock of geopolitical stability and the engine of global consumption. But today, that bedrock is fracturing under the weight of a systemic liquidation that is as mathematical as it is inevitable. We are witnessing the quiet, calculated dismantling of the most significant socioeconomic achievement of the 20th century, not through a single catastrophic event, but through 1,000 invisible cuts in purchasing power, the weaponization of debt, and the fundamental restructuring of how wealth is captured and held. The safety net that once caught the ambitious is being rewoven into a net that traps them, and the mechanisms of this transition are hidden in plain sight within the ledgers of central banks and the boardrooms of the world's most powerful institutional investors. This is not a simple story of inflation or rising costs, but a narrative of the Great Compression, where the space between the ultra-wealthy elite and the subsistence-level working class is being forcibly closed. The stakes could not be higher. When the middle class dissolves, the buffer that prevents social volatility and political extremism disappears along with it. We are entering an era of neo-feudalism, where ownership is being replaced by subscription, and the ability to build intergenerational wealth, once the hallmark of middle-class life, is being systematically phased out. To understand why this is happening now, we must look past the daily noise of the stock market and examine the deep architectural flaws of our monetary system flaws that have reached a terminal point where the system can only survive by consuming its own creator. To trace the origins of this liquidation, we must return to the post-World War II era, a time when the world was being rebuilt under the Bretton Woods Agreement. In the 1950s and 60s, the golden age of capitalism saw a unique synergy where productivity gains were directly tethered to wage growth. According to historical data from the Economic Policy Institute, this was the only period in modern history where the average worker's income grew in lockstep with the economy, his overall output. This was largely possible because the US dollar was anchored to gold, placing a physical limit on the amount of credit that could be created. However, the seeds of the current liquidation were planted in 1971 when the Nixon administration severed that final link to reality. By moving to a pure fiat system, the global economy transitioned from a production-based model to a debt-based model, and the decoupling began. For the first time, productivity continued to climb while real wages flattened, creating a massive surplus of value that no longer flowed to the middle class, but instead flowed upward into the financial sector. This deep dive into the 1970s reveals a pivotal shift in the narrative of empire. As the United States struggled with the costs of the Vietnam War and the expansion of the Great Society programs, the Federal Reserve faced a choice: accept a painful economic contraction or inflate the debt away. They chose the latter, initiating a cycle of financialization that transformed the economy from one that makes things into one that manages debt. In this new world, the primary way to build wealth was no longer through labor, but through the ownership of assets, real estate, stocks, and bonds. For the middle class, this felt like prosperity at first as home prices began to climb. But this was a mirage. The wealth was not being created by the homes themselves, but by the debasement of the currency used to price them. As the cost of assets rose faster than the cost of labor, the ladder to the middle class began to lose its bottom rungs, making it increasingly difficult for those without existing capital to ever enter the game. The mechanism behind this liquidation is rooted in the Cantillon Effect, an economic phenomenon named after Richard Cantillon, who observed that when a state creates new money, those closest to the source of that money, the banks and the government, benefit the most, while those furthest away, the wage earners, suffer the most. In our modern system, when the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank engages in quantitative easing, they are injecting liquidity directly into the financial veins of the system. This drives up the price of assets held by the wealthy, while the resulting inflation in food, energy, and housing eventually trickles down to the middle class, who find their fixed salaries buying less and less each year. This is a hidden tax that slowly drains the equity out of the middle class without a single vote ever being cast in a legislature. It is a liquidation of purchasing power that forces the average family to take on more debt just to maintain their standard of living, effectively turning the middle class into a class of debt servants. We see a chilling parallel to this today in the late-stage Roman Empire, or the Weimar Republic of the 1920s. In both instances, the state reached a point where its promises exceeded its productivity. In Rome, the silver content of the denarius was slowly reduced over centuries, until it was essentially a copper coin washed in silver. In Weimar Germany, the Reichsbank printed money at such an astronomical rate that the middle-class OS life savings were liquidated in a matter of months, while the industrial elites who held physical assets and foreign debt grew immensely powerful. Today's liquidation is more sophisticated and slower, but the logic remains the same. When a system is buried in debt, it can never repay. It must eventually default. But a sovereign nation rarely defaults honestly. It defaults through inflation, which is a default on the value of the currency itself. The middle class, which holds its wealth primarily in cash-denominated savings, pensions, and home equity, is the primary target of this default. The hidden forces at play here are not the result of a singular conspiracy, but a convergence of institutional incentives. BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, the Big Three, now manage a combined $20 trillion in assets, a sum larger than the GDP of most nations. These institutions, along with private equity firms, have begun a massive pivot into residential real estate. By moving from commercial to consumer asset classes, they are competing directly with the middle-class family for the American and European dream. When a $1 trillion fund outbids a young family for a starter home, they aren't just buying property. They are converting a potential owner into a permanent renter. This is the subscription economy in its most predatory form. By removing the ability to own land, these power structures are effectively liquidating the primary mechanism of middle-class wealth accumulation, ensuring that future cash flows are diverted back into the financial system rather than staying within the family unit. This acceleration phase is defined by the cost of living squeeze, a structural phenomenon where the essential pillars of middle-class security, education, healthcare, and housing have inflated at 3 to 4 times the rate of the consumer price index. While the official statistics provided by government agencies often suggest a modest, manageable inflation rate, they frequently use hedonic adjustments and substitution models that mask the true cost of maintaining a middle-class lifestyle. For instance, the price of a television may drop, but the cost of a college degree or a life-saving medical procedure has skyrocketed. This is not accidental. It is a manifestation of the two-tiered economy. As the industrial base of the West was offshored to seek lower labor costs, the middle class was forced into the service and knowledge sectors, which are now being threatened by the rapid advancement of automation and artificial intelligence. This creates a squeezed middle that is being attacked from above by asset inflation and from below by wage stagnation. The acceleration is further compounded by the global tax competition and the mobility of capital. While the middle class is geographically tethered, paying local property taxes, income taxes, and sales taxes, the ultra-wealthy and multinational corporations operate in a borderless digital landscape. This allows the highest earners to utilize complex offshore structures and tax havens to minimize their contributions to the social contract, while the tax burden of maintaining infrastructure and social programs falls increasingly on the shoulders of the middle class. According to data from the IMF and various tax justice analyses, trillions of dollars are shielded from the traditional tax base, creating a fiscal gap that governments fill by printing more money or increasing the tax pressure on those who cannot move their wealth, the homeowners and the salaried professionals. This leads to a capital flight from the bottom up, where the seeds of future prosperity are taxed away before they can even be planted. As we look at the narrative arc of this liquidation, we must examine the debt trap set by modern consumer finance. In the mid-20th century, credit was used as a tool for occasional large-scale investments like a home or a car. Today, credit has become a permanent feature of daily survival. The buy now, pay later model and the ubiquity of revolving credit have effectively turned future labor into present-day consumption, but at a steep cost. This is the ultimate form of liquidation, the liquidation of time itself. When a person is born into a system where they must take on 5 figures of debt just to get an education, and 6 figures of debt to have a roof over their head, they are not a free economic agent. They are a pre-leveraged asset for the banking system. The interest paid over a lifetime on these debts represents a massive wealth transfer from the individual to the financial institution, ensuring that the middle class remains in a state of treadmill economics, working harder and longer just to stay in the same place. The parallel to historical precedents becomes even more stark when we look at the modern hollowing out of the industrial heartlands. In the 19th century British Empire, the rise of the financial city of London eventually led to the neglect of the manufacturing north. The empire focused on managing global flows of capital rather than domestic production, leading to a wealthy financial elite at the expense of a crumbling domestic middle class. We see this exact pattern repeating in the rust belts of the United States and Europe. As the financial sector grows to represent a larger and larger share of GDP, the real economy, the one that provides stable, high-paying jobs for the middle class, withers. This is the Dutch disease of finance, when one sector becomes so dominant that it starves all others of talent and capital. The result is a society that is rich on paper but poor in reality, with a middle class that is increasingly surplus to the requirements of a globalized, automated, and financialized world. The climax of this process is the big truth, that the modern economy has transitioned from a system of wealth creation to one of wealth extraction. We have moved into what economists call a rentier economy. In this stage, the most profitable path for capital is no longer to build a better factory or invent a more efficient tool, but to capture a toll bridge over necessity. This is why we see the aggressive push toward the subscription of everything. When the middle class can no longer afford to own the car they drive, the software they use, or the home they live in, they are forced to pay a perpetual rent to the owners of capital. This is the ultimate liquidation, the conversion of a person S lifetime of labor into a permanent stream of dividend payments for the institutional elite. In this model, the middle class does not disappear into thin air. It is slowly metabolized by the financial system until all that remains is a consumer unit with no equity and no exit strategy. The revelation is that this is not a mistake or a series of policy errors, but the logical conclusion of a fiat currency system at the end of its life cycle. Every currency that is not tethered to a physical reality eventually expands until the debt becomes unpayable. At that point, the system must either collapse or find a way to harvest the remaining value held by the population. The liquidation of the middle class is that harvest. By devaluing the currency, the real value of the state's debt decreases, while the real cost of living for the average person increases. It is a massive, invisible transfer of wealth from the savers to the debtors, and the largest debtor in the world is the government itself. This is the foremost financial repression that defines the current era, keeping interest rates below the rate of inflation to slowly erode the value of what you own to pay for what they owe. As we enter the final phase of this documentary, we must look at the social consequence of this economic evaporation. Historically, the collapse of the middle class is the primary precursor to political upheaval. When the promise of upward mobility is broken, the social contract is voided. In the 1930s, the liquidation of the European middle class led directly to the rise of populism and the eventual descent into total war. Today, the symptoms are strikingly similar: a loss of trust in institutions, the polarization of the electorate, and a growing sense that the game is rigged. This is the danger of the current trajectory. An economy without a middle class is an economy without a stabilizer. It is a system of extremes that is inherently fragile and prone to violent corrections. The ending of this story is not yet written, but the historical grounding is clear. Empires do not fall because they run out of money. They fall because they destroy the productivity and the spirit of the people who make the money valuable in the first place. The liquidation of the middle class is a warning sign that we are nearing the 0 hour of a major economic reset. We are at a crossroads where the world must decide if it will continue to prioritize the protection of a debt-based financial architecture, or if it will return to an economy that values labor ownership and the stability of the family unit. The pattern is repeating, the data is undeniable, and the window for a soft landing is closing. The acceleration of this liquidation is further exacerbated by the taxation of inflation, a phenomenon where the middle class is pushed into higher tax brackets even as their real purchasing power declines. This is known as bracket creep, because tax codes are often slow to adjust for the actual cost of living. A nominal increase in wages, meant only to keep pace with the rising cost of bread and fuel, results in a larger percentage of that income being seized by the state. For the elite, whose wealth is primarily held in capital gains or offshore entities, the tax structure remains relatively static or even favorable. But for the professional class, every attempt to swim against the current of inflation results in a heavier weight being added to their shoulders. It is a systematic stripping of the surplus capital that a family would otherwise use to invest in their own future, effectively capping their economic potential at a level of mere subsistence. Simultaneously, we are witnessing the financialization of the human life cycle. In the previous era, life milestones were funded by savings. Today, they are products of the debt market. We have moved from a society of life savings to a society of lifelong leverage. From student loans at age 18 to the reverse mortgage at age 70, the financial industry has designed a product to capture every stage of a human's existence. This ensures that the middle class never truly reaches a state of financial independence. Even in retirement, the wealth accumulated over decades is often liquidated to pay for the skyrocketing costs of privatized elder care, ensuring that very little, if any, wealth is passed down to the next generation. This break in the chain of intergenerational wealth is the final blow to the middle class, as it prevents the compounding of capital that historically allowed families to move up the social strata. The geopolitical dimension of this liquidation cannot be ignored as it relates to the export of deflation. For decades, the Western middle class was shielded from the consequences of their own deindustrialization by the influx of cheap goods from emerging markets. This was a Faustian bargain, The middle class lost their high-paying manufacturing jobs, but gained access to inexpensive electronics and consumer goods. However, as global wages equalize and supply chains fracture due to geopolitical tensions, that deflationary subsidy is vanishing. As the cost of imported goods rises, the Western consumer is suddenly confronted with the reality that their domestic economy can no longer produce what they need at a price they can afford. This is the reshoring trap, where the return of industry comes with a price tag that the now liquidated middle class can no longer pay, leading to a permanent reduction in the standard of living. Furthermore, the technological displacement of the cognitive elite is now in its primary stage. While the first wave of automation replaced physical labor, the current wave of generative models and algorithmic management is targeting the white-collar professions: law, accounting, middle management, and creative services. These roles have traditionally been the stronghold of the middle class, providing the high income stability required to service large mortgages and private education. As these roles are optimized or eliminated, the job polarization of the economy intensifies. We are left with a barbell economy: high-paying roles for a tiny sliver of tech owners at the top, and low-paying manual service roles at the bottom. The middle, the space where the majority of the population used to reside, is being hollowed out by code and silicon, leaving a professional class with expensive degrees but no market for their skills. In the shadows of this transition lies the social credit of debt. In a society where ownership is rare and everything is rented or financed, the individual's survival becomes dependent on their standing within the financial system. A person who is liquidated of their assets has no FU money, no ability to dissent, and no autonomy. They must remain compliant with the demands of the corporate and state structures just to maintain access to the digital tools and housing they subscribe to. This is the soft totalitarianism of the liquidated class. Independence is replaced by dependency, and the rugged individualism that once defined the middle-class spirit is replaced by a desperate, precarious loyalty to the system that is slowly consuming them. The liquidation is therefore not just financial, it is a liquidation of the very concept of the independent citizen. The real estate absorption by institutional capital is now moving into its most aggressive phase. We are seeing the rise of build-to-rent communities, where entire neighborhoods are constructed not for sale to families, but for the balance sheets of pension funds and insurance companies. This represents a fundamental shift in the land tenure system of the West. When land is owned by the people, power is decentralized. When land is owned by a few massive institutions, power is concentrated. This is the return of the manorial system, where the inhabitants are not citizens with a stake in the land, but tenants who pay a tithe for the privilege of existing on it. By removing the primary asset of the middle class, the family home, the system ensures that the wealth generated by the labor of the population is immediately recycled back into the coffers of the financial elite. As the currency debasement reaches its vertical phase, the middle class begins to experience psychological liquidation. This is the moment when the population realizes that the old rules, saving money, working hard, and playing by the book, no longer work. This leads to a breakdown in social cohesion and the rise of speculative fever, where people begin to gamble on highly volatile assets, not out of greed, but out of a desperate need to outrun the melting of their purchasing power. This behavior further destabilizes the economy, creating a feedback loop of volatility that serves as the final precursor to a systemic reset. When a society loses its ability to plan for the long term because the currency is unreliable, the very foundations of civilization begin to erode. The final revelation is the understanding that the middle class was a product of a specific monetary environment, one that required a large, stable population to facilitate the expansion of credit. Now that the credit system has reached its mathematical limit, that population is no longer an asset to the system. It is a liability. The liquidation is the process of resolving that liability. It is the final closing of the ledger of the 20th century. What comes next is not a return to the normalcy of the 1950s, but a leap into a new, highly controlled, and highly stratified economic reality. The pattern has been identified, the mechanisms are in motion, and the era of the independent middle class is being brought to a calculated, orderly end.